And so before Takeo, I was a developer in Shopee, and then I moved to Facebook. And after short few years there, I moved to Takeo. Been like half a year. So the topic today, I want to talk about how to write a good merge request, and more generally, how do you conduct effective code review. The reason is that so for the past few months, I have been working with the Ho Chi Minh 5 teams under Dũng and Ho Chung Dũng, and I have been like reviewing their code recently. So I have seen a few patterns of problems that I think is pretty simple to fix and pretty effective. So that's the intention of sharing today. All right. So we'll go to a few topics first. First is a problem. And so from what I see, from the MRs I have seen, the problem is that it's pretty hard to review. A lot of the times you have one merge request and it is a whole big features. So for example, you have like, you create a new screen for a front end, or you want to create a new flow for like the ERP system. For example, things like create an orders or create a return. So usually that type MR is pretty big because there are a lot of changes. You have to touch a lot of different components. The problem is that with huge MR like that, it takes a long time to review. And if your reviewer is a really good one and he's going to be very thorough, then it's going to take a lot of time. Or maybe like because it's so huge, then people are really afraid of reviewing that. Like people don't have time to look at your MR, so the review is really short. The problem is that nobody can guarantee the qualities of your code, and it might have bugs in the futures. So what we want is to make the review more effective, so that the bugs can be spotted early on in the review process. Secondly, we also want to make to save the time for the reviewers. So okay, so I have identified like 4 problems and 4 areas that we can improve, and maybe after like every 2 points, I stop for like 5 minutes so that people can start asking questions, so I can answer on the spot. All right. Okay, so the first problem is the scoping of the merge request. This is usually the biggest problem that we have, and actually in every company it is the same thing. The problem is that your merge request scope is too big. So, for example, your tech lead said that you should implement 1 features, and Minh as a developer wait 10 days, and then I create a huge MR. So it's very hard to review for my tech lead to review, and let's say in 1 month or 3 months, there's a live issues. It's very hard to revert because it's so big. So instead of creating 1 big merge request at the end of the sprint, we can try to create a few smaller merge requests first, so that we can get a review quickly. And ideally, your one merge request should only contain 1 idea. So why does it happen? The problem happens is because usually when we're doing sprint planning, right, each developer is assigned 1 ticket for 1 features. And usually maybe like many people think that 1 ticket means that you have 1 merge request. It's better, but in fact it's better to have 1 ticket, can be like a multiple merge request, can have many requests. And on the other hand, you don't really need to break down the ticket too small. Like for example, I asked you to implement a login screen. Then the ticket just say implement login screen. But you can have like multiple MR. The first MR is to define a new route for the page. And the second MR can be like adding a few buttons. And the final MR can be integrating with the backend APIs. So the breakdown can be done, like you don't need to break down the ticket, but you need to break down the merge request. So it is actually easier. People think that it's easier. Actually, it's easier to write a big MR than a few smaller ones. That's true. So that's why we are all doing it, even me. But the way we do that, we call the code review to be less effective. Because as I mentioned earlier, you have a huge MR, then people, it's very hard for us to understand what's going on, like how is the interactions between different components. So, and also like imagine if you are the reviewers, right, your tech lead, or you are the tech lead in the futures, you will not be happy. You see a coach by your team members, that's too long, right? So another assumptions that we have one MR instead of multiple MR is that we think that one MR, you have one features and one merge request, is easier to revert in case there's any problem. But this is usually not the case, because you can think about the features, right? The feature usually had a pretty large scope, and you have a large scope, you have to touch multiple components, so that the process of reverting multiple components at once can be really like risky. But on the other hand, if you have like small changes on top of each other, then actually you can do like revert for one component at a time. So that means so small changes is easier to undo. And another reason that I see that people stick with one MR instead of multiple one is that they think that because I don't want to merge this new feature in master yet, because like this not tested, for example, then you have to wait until the end of spring where everything is ready, and then you merge it into one feature branch. And then you have to merge that feature branch into master, and you pray that there's no conflict. So that process is pretty error prone. You can actually use feature flag to hide the new code gradually in your code. So let's say you are adding a login screen, right? You can actually hide the route, the new route for the login behind a feature flag, and then just keep adding code over there. So the code can be still in production, but it cannot be seen by the customer. And we can turn that on for the QC to test it in our development environments. All right, so here are some do's and don'ts for the scoping of one MR. So what you should do is that for each of these things, you should be able to have one MR. For example, you define the new API protocol, or you have a new migration, you change the structure of the tables, or you want to implement a new API. So after the proto and the migration is done, preferably, or you want to do one bug fix, or you want to do a refactoring for your code base. What you don't want to do is that you want to implement a features, like you add a new proto, you add a new database changes, and also implement the features at once. Then the scope generally is become very huge, like a few hundred lines, 200-300 lines at least. And also don't do a bug fix and refactor at the same time. I see this a lot, where you fix a bug, you see the function names or variable name is not really nice, so you change it in the same merge request. I used to do this, but and sometimes I still do this now, but I have observed that sometimes I create a box, another box after the bug fix. So it's not really safe to do that kind of things. Yeah, right. So let's look at some real life examples from our code base. These are courtesies of the inventory teams, and I asked Tường and Hùng that I can use that code example. So thank you very much for that. So the first MR that I want to show you is this one. So let's look at the description. So basically, this MR is, yeah, actually I don't understand word by words, but they're trying to replace the communication channel between two systems. The first one, the inventory service, and the second one is the inventory stream. So it's a communication channel. The first thing that you see is that this MR has 29 changes. That means 29, like 35 was changed. And you can see from the photos here, like a lot of system was changed. And you have some library changes, you have multiple service changes, you have new protobuf, you have, let's see, you have even migrations, I guess. Yeah, you have some SQL here, and also you have a lot of Go file where you implement the changes. So this typical routes that we're doing, where we do have one features and we throw everything together. So for me, I had to review this change, and I was freaking out. Like, I don't understand what's going on. So for this, what you should do is the first one, you want to create a migration for each of the service. Secondly, you define the new protobuf here. And the final MR, you want to add a code to glue it together. So this MR can easily be split into 3 different MRs. That I would think is better. So that's the first one. The second one, these are pretty big features. It's called whole inventory at checkout. And we're still, as far as I know, we are still testing this. So this MR is pretty recent. Oh, and the MR here is like 62 files. So it's like double the size of the previous one. All right, so you can see that the same patterns, you have SQL file, you have a lot of like mock, you have a lot of like protobuf, and also you change the repository, you change some service, and you change some APIs. So remember, if you are in this situation in the future, try to have the MR smaller by splitting into like one MR should just have one idea. That's the thing. The title here is like whole inventory at checkout is too big for the scope. So I would rather zoom to actually make one MR for the proto, one MR for the migrations, and one MR for implementations. All right. So here's a few rules of thumbs. Basically, like how do you tell if the MR is too big? So for example, if the titles of the most request had the word "and," then probably you are having 2 ideas. So that means it's probably too big. Secondly, you will have many files that are affected. For example, in this case, you have like 60 files and 30 files. Then it might be time to split it up. Or like I've seen this in some teams where you have like 2 weeks of sprint, and during that 2 weeks, right, there's a lot of project management, but nobody creates any merge requests. But at the Friday, at the end of the sprint, then the tech lead received like 5 or 6 MR, because people were just like keeping the MR to themselves and not splitting them up, so that they cannot be reviewed before the final day. So that's very bad, because there can be a lot of conflicts, and also it can resolving the conflicts can be costly, and it might delay the sprint by a few days. So yeah, so please try to have like frequent MR, small MR during the sprint until the last day. All right, so the second problem we have is readability. So not sure if everyone heard the jokes that in computer science, that 2 hardest thing. The first one is naming things. The second one is evaluating the cache. So it's pretty true, because most of the previous company I worked for, people are really peculiar about the naming. So you work longer in the industry, then you see that there's a focus on readabilities. So personally in the company, I have seen like functions which are few hundred lines, and it's very hard to understand what it's doing. And from my experience working in big companies like Facebook, then they have a very thorough code review process. So besides the logics have to be correct, you have a lot of testing. Your merge request will be rejected if it's not reader friendly. That means the reviewer just doesn't like the code style. So it's a problem. The readability is low, like very bad readability can be a problem when there are more developers and more teams. So just think of like if you're a tech lead, right? People are going to leave the teams, leave the company, and if the code is not readable, then nobody can maintain the code. And also, like you have new people join the teams, and it's very hard for them to understand and the existing code. So the naming, there are some tips that we can use. I guess it is pretty popular knowledge for everybody, but I just want to repeat this. For naming, don't try to use obscure name. Like don't try to use like short variables where you can use a more descriptive one. Also, don't try to use very like long variable either. So first of all, yeah, you don't try to use like verify arguments and save order to database. In this case, just like save order would be enough. And so just want to emphasize this point is that the longer you work as a developer in the industry, the more codes you're going to read. And actually, my experience is that 80% of the times are code reviewing. So don't try to optimize for code writing. Don't try to use short name or clever name. Especially true if you are a tech lead, going to spend most of the time reading people's code and reviews people's code. So for the tech lead, you should also look for like encouraging people to maintain readabilities. So one example is this. So here's one piece of code that has seen like 3 variables that they're all shorthand for something. Probably this case still read a bit readable, but it's not really recommended that you're going to do this way. So like for WH, you can just use like a warehouse. H type is like whole types and HI is whole items. For newcomers to your code base, people might not be able to guess. So please keep in mind that your code should be readable even by the people from other team. Right. All right. So for the second point in readabilities is decomposition. It just means that you need to split your functions into smaller ones. So the benefit is that the logic flow is easier to understand. And also like if you have smaller functions, you want to write tests for them, it's much easier. You have functions like doing many things at once, and then it's very hard to test the functionalities. All right, so here's one example. So this like usually I was in the fulfillment routers team, and we have some piece of code that looks like this. So we're trying to create you have an order, then you want to create a few shipment for the order so that you can send them to our third party, and those third party can send the shipment to our customer. So you can see here that we have the first block where you load the orders, and then the second block is to go through the items and make sure that we have enough stock for each items, and we do some validations before we create the shipments. And finally, we want to send some kind of message to another service to record the state. So I'll say like most of the time is if the length is not too long, then it's okay to do like this. But if you have more complicated logic in each of the block, then it might be smarter to just split them up. So here's one suggestion. So this what I would rather do. You have like the logic can be pretty complicated. So the first block is still to load the orders, but the second block where you want to create a shipment, you can just create another heap of functions to create that. And Similarly, you can create another function just to send shipments to another third party. Right, so rules of thumb for this, if your function is like 100 lines of code, maybe it's time to split. Or like you have a lot of nested logic, then it's also it's time to split. So in example, right, you have like a feature flag, and if the feature flag is turned on, you want to do a different flow, for example, then might be this flow can be encapsulated in another functions. All right, so I think we have covered 2 points, and I want to pause here in case people want to have question. So yeah, just fire it. Anybody has any question on the 2 points above? Oh, okay. Okay, so Mr. Fu has asked me to review his MR. All right, I will do it later. Sure. Okay, so we can try do it. We still have some times. Oh my God, it's 1,000 lines of code. Wow. So okay, so I think I heard that you okay. So I know about this problem. So actually, I think this is kind of a special case that I'm going to talk about at the end of the talk. So there are cases where you can violate this rule. You don't have to follow these guidelines, right?
No, so actually for this kind of auto-generated change, I assume this is auto-generated. I don't think you manually make all of these changes. So usually for this mask refactor, it's often done with a script, right? So what people can do for this kind of thing is to actually review the generation script itself. So that actually can be very helpful.
Well, Phương, you just spoiled the rest of my slide. So that's what I'm going to talk next, right? Cool. All right. So any other question, or I can move on? All right. Seeing this is pretty obvious to people. That's what I'm talking about. Great. All right. So for the length of the MR, so we have seen previously just seen merge request by full, which is 1,000 changes. So let's see if it can be accepted. I'm sure it is, but okay, here's a few principles. So what's the problem with the length of the MR? So the problem is that the longer the merge request, that means the reviewer has to spend a longer time to review. And maybe they don't spend a long time. That means the code is the review is less effective. They just overlook it. So when I was at Facebook, I remember that they have a tools where each MR, there's a count of how many lines of code are changes. And also there's an estimate beside that. So Facebook estimate that it takes 20 minutes to review 100 lines of code. So yeah. So and the point is that like you have 200 lines of code. The estimate is like 50 minutes or 60 minutes. So you can see that the you have like the MI is twice longer. It doesn't take twice longer time to review it. It takes might be much like 3 times, 4 times longer, because there can be a lot of interactions that you need to review. So keep that in mind. You have like MR longer like that. It's going to be helpful for the reviewer. So question: how long should it be? Is 1,000 lines MR? I mean, is 1,000 line MRs okay? The question is, it depends, right? So as Phil mentioned earlier, some MR are pretty huge, but they are not actually complicated. So you have like protobuf, like you do the code generations. you can easily have a few hundred lines without doing anything. Or if you want to do some refactoring, you are renaming a functions, renames an API, or renames a field, then if your function is used a lot, then the MR is going to be huge. So for this kind of scenario, it makes sense to carry out this change in one MR. You don't really want to refactor, like have multiple, rename the function like multiple times. It makes sense to just in one MR. But besides those cases, you might need to have a very good reason to keep it long. So the good reason might be justifiable to your tech lead or to your reviewer, and your reviewer might ask like, why do you keep it very long? Yeah, so keep that in mind. So try to stick to the principle of one merge request, one idea as much as possible. So yeah, so I put a rule of thumbs here, like 200 lines of code, except for code gens, but it's not really a rules. So it's more like you see somebody exceeded this count, then look at the change and see whether it can be split into multiple MRs, or it makes sense to just do it in the same merge request. All right. Finally is the descriptions. So the description, the MR, how you to write a good description. Please always include a description, even though your title already says something. Your description should be to tell more about why you do the merge request, the background that we need to know to review the MR, and also you want to tell us like you are unsure about certain parts and you want us to focus on reviewing those parts. And also don't just like include like one the Jira ticket in the description, because it's very hard for the reviewer to go to the ticket, read through all the changes, all the description in the ticket, and understand what's about. Your description should be just like a summary of a high-level overview of what's changing here. Secondly, your description should include a test plan, and the test plan, the most important function for us is to make the reviewer confident that you have tested this. And secondly, it makes it easier that in the future somebody changes the same code, they can look back to the MR and reproduce the test. So some suggestion for the backend is you can have unit tests or integration tests to MR. For the front end, you can have like a screenshot, video of the change, or sometimes you can do unit tests. But from what I see, people usually do screenshot and videos for front-end changes. For migration, then you can just like copy the command line, the output that is successful in your local machine. All right, so so far I have talked about 4 topics of like 4 patterns that we see, but they are just guidelines. They are not rules, right? There are certain situations when you need to break the guidelines. So for example, so let's say you have a very tight deadline. Let's say your tech lead say, hey Minh, in 3 days, you need to implement these features because our customer is demanding it and we cannot wait. So just go ahead and implement the features as quick as possible, because you have no time to make your MR look nice, or you have follow all the best practices. The priorities now is to deliver the features. There are exceptions when the second exception is that when you're working your own code, like example, you are experimenting with some things, like you want to create a new services, but you are the only one who created it, and you're not sure that it's going to be used in the futures. Then for those cases, we can accept like the code does not look really nice. And the final class of exception is where you have urgent fix. So let's say you have live issues, right? And you have like customer cannot place order on VN Shop. then your priority should be just to fix the problem as fast as possible. So you don't need to follow any guidelines. Again, you like short names, long names, or you can have change the same function. It doesn't matter. The priority is on fixing the issue, not on keeping the code looks nice. All right, so I'm going to cover this. The final point is so the previous point is about the code writer responsibilities, but the final point is about you as a reviewer. What should you do? So the reviewers, as a reviewer, then mostly you are either tech leads, or if you practice like peer review, you can actually keep the qualities of the team higher. So you should spend. So usually it goes like this: when people are new to the teams, you spend more effort to review their first MR. So I don't know what it was full experience or G experience, but when I was at Facebook, then it took me a few days to land my first MR. So people are really like correcting you a lot of best practices, how you should switch the functions, how you should name the variables, how you should leave comments here and there. And this is good because it's the fastest way that people can learn what's the best practice at the company. And also, like as a reviewer, you should keep reminding the submitter to fix a certain problems. So, for example, then when I was reviewing the inventories team code, they usually submit very big merge requests. So every merge request, I'll say, please split it into smaller MR next time if you have the time. So after like I think a few weeks, then people just keep like telling each other to do that. So it's nice to see the yeah. I mean, it pays to be persistent. Also, finally, there's a class of suggestion where uh, is called the needs, like very like trivial points that you just leave a comment like I want you to don't use too much spacing, or you want to change the variable naming into something else. These kind of problems, you usually like we don't require them to fix. It's just a suggestion. It's up to the code writers um, to see whether they want to fix them or not. But it's okay to merge that. Uh, all right, so I think I'm going to end of the takeaways here. So the takeaway is that so I order by the most important point first. So you have should have a single scope merge request, and also try to make your code readable because it's very important for future maintainabilities. Try to keep it short if you can, and also write helpful description and test plan. Uh, but uh, as every rules, they're meant to be broken. They're just guidelines. So you as a reviewer have to use your own judgment. Don't be don't it doesn't always require you to keep the guidelines. Right. And finally, here are some MR that I have reviewed from the inventory team. So if you want to look at how I review the code, then you can click on these links here. I guess that's the end of my slide. Special thanks to inventory teams for letting me review the works and use the materials here. So I think I leave the next few minutes we leave to Q&A. You have any question? So do you see this principle apply in your team's work, for example? Cool. I think seems like people either understand it or they haven't really used that, or and don't understand it. Yeah. Or they are like having dinners already. Cool. Right. Okay. Anyway, okay. So you can always refer back to the slide. I'm going to share the link later in the group, and hopefully that you can use some of them, the guidelines, in when you're reviewing the code. Thank you, everyone. Bye.